high five. Saludos and salutations, Broncos country. Welcome to another exciting episode of Broncos Talk. I'm your host, Adam Diaz, and joining me, as always, is my co-host, Richie. Richie, how are you doing today, my friend?
I'm doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Thank you very much. And guys, welcome. Let's say hello to everybody in the room. Dave Glasman, hello, my friend, Mohammed Badri, and of course, the boss McCreasy saying what up, Mobad. Guys, before we kick off today's show, I want to go over a couple things with you. Just as a friendly reminder, we are on a quest for 1,000 subs. If you see that hashtag right over my good friend co-host Richie's head, hashtag quest for 1,000. Guys, we need your help and we need your support to get to 1,000 subscribers because we are growing. And you might not see the big picture, but behind the scenes, folks, we're gradually growing. We're growing little by little. And we're expanding, man. And, you know, it's, dare I say, we one day might be like Amazon big, you know, to fill out all of Broncos country. But folks, make sure you like and share this video on Twitter, Facebook. You see the hashtags on the bottom where you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and of course, Twitch at MHRT Podcast. And as always, thanks to everyone who's already a supporter. We and subscribe to the channel. Richie and I really do appreciate you guys finding the time to tune in and listen to us, whether you're watching us live at the moment or you're listening to us on audio after said events. So, yes, Richie.
If you can just add to that, I want to, if we can, everyone that can, who's live today, to share out the live video stream with those that are connected with them. We can get as many Broncos country fans in here as possible. It really does help the show both grow and get more eyeballs and more comments in here. I love the live audience that comes in for pods like this and that connection back and forth with like-minded fans or fans that maybe aren't as like-minded as we are, and just have that, you know, dialogue amongst Broncos country. So please like, share, and also once the video is over, I always check for comments afterwards. So if you guys want to engage and answer some of the questions we asked during the show, please go ahead and leave those comments. Let's keep everyone engaged as things going on, and we can have those conversations even after the fact.
Very well said. Also, for anybody listening or watching us for the very first time, we are a fan-based led podcast, which means the ideas and expressions and opinions you hear on the show are clearly of Richie and myself. We are not, beat writers. We are not here to give you any detailed information. Sometimes we get it right and sometimes we get it wrong. And, but that's the beauty of it. Having your opinion in Broncos country goes a long way. And also, if you guys have any comments or questions that you want to share with Rich and I during the show, we're going to try to answer everybody's questions and get to everybody's comments as best as we can with the time allotted to us. So with that said, Rich, we're going to kick off today's show. If you guys saw the thumbnail, Steve the Greek, I've been working on trying to say his last name, Antonopoulos, I hope I said that right, has decided to retire after more than 45 years in the NFL as the director of sports medicine for the Denver Broncos. So for those of you who may not know who this man is, he was literally responsible for making sure how to keep up with the health of all the players and making sure that they were recovering from their injuries. Now, he wasn't in that position the entirety of his career. He started off, from working his way up the chain. But one of the greatest, one of the best feats I saw from his detailed career resume, Rich, was the fact that he was at every single Super Bowl. So, I mean, that is amazing for somebody who wasn't an actual NFL player. So he's been through the lows and he's also been there for the highs. So I just want to say thanks to the Greek. We wish you the best in retirement. And we do hope whoever your successor is, they have some big shoes to fill.
I couldn't agree more. The other thing that I made particularly note of, and I think I made a comment of it the last few pods, is when Greek was our head trainer and he was the main guy, we did, for whatever reason, seem to have fewer lower body injuries, it seemed, on the team. And I don't know if it's the style of training. I don't know if it's the players coming in that are just kind of trained differently coming into the league. But certainly one of the things that I did notice is that when Greek kind of took a step back or step up kind of to oversee things, and we brought in a new head trainer, we certainly did see an awful lot of lower body injuries that I don't recall having quite as many of under Greek's tutelage, which is, I'll be quite honest, I knew his first name was Steve, but I literally primarily knew him as Greek because that's what I think every interview I ever heard, including Elway and everybody else, I just heard everyone just call him, Greek.
Right. Yeah, but it's a very vital part of any football organization is, overseeing that entire, I was going to say division, but I guess team is the word I'm looking for here, Rich. And, he's been through the battered Elways. He's been through the struggling Cutlers and Kyle Ortons of the world. So he's been there. And if I'm not mistaken, the Broncos are naming a part of their facility. I don't know if it's their training area. They're dedicating it in his honor. So that's a very, very thoughtful thing by the Broncos organization.
I think that's fitting. I mean, anytime you have someone that's been with your organization for 40 plus years, contributed to all of your Super Bowl wins as a team, aside from the ring of honor or anything along those lines, the next best, or frankly, even perhaps more visible thing to all the players is to actually name, a wing or a major part of your facility after that particular individual, especially considering, by all accounts, I have never heard anybody speak ill of him ever.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And I think that speaks volumes.
Yes, agreed. So we're going to miss you, Greek. We wish you the very best. Travis Tarbox checking in. He says, "What's up, fellas? Denver Bronco for life." Thank you for joining in, my friend. And, we're going to move on to another subject going around Broncos country today, Rich, and that's the quarterback battle between Teddy Bridgewater and Drew Lock. Now, there is, and I've actually been reading reports of other quarterbacks that have been struggling in practice, most notably Jordan Love, who took his first reps as starting quarterback with the starting team, if I'm not mistaken, in the absence of one Aaron Rodgers. And then another one where Trevor Lawrence threw back-to-back pick sixes and is now suffering from, and I quote, hamstring tightness, which is not serious. He's supposed to be, getting better. But it's kind of, and also that reminds me of something that I saw Boggins put up on Twitter earlier today, where he mentions that while it's not the biggest deal, seeing quarterbacks throw interceptions or what have you, it is kind of like an insight as to, it's not the mistakes that they make, but it's how they correct from making those mistakes, and in terms of, quarterback play.
So I'm going to take a quote from one of your favorite guys on one of your favorite shows and toss it in here. So I too, on occasion, will watch Undisputed. And Shannon actually was the one that brought this forward. And I thought is really interesting in terms of insight. Some things I agree with what he says, some things I don't. But this I actually thought was really insightful because it came from a player's perspective and really made quite a bit of sense to me when I heard it. OTAs and mini camps and this type of stuff that we're seeing now. He made a comment that a lot of the times this is time to throw and mix stuff in and mess around with concepts that might be in the playbook, but not apply them exactly as designed in the playbook to see what the comfort level of various players is as well. And he mentioned that when he was playing and whatnot, that they did those types of things as well. So I do think as fans, particularly as fans, because a lot of information we get is either not firsthand because we're not able to attend because we're not members of the press or any of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of us don't necessarily have the absolute direct or most inside track to kind of the direct team information. Although I'd argue that most members of the media don't either, is we don't know what the actual play was. We don't know what the variation off of the actual play was either. So it's very difficult to directly judge when a mistake like that happens because we don't know what the original play in the playbook was and if it was in fact a variation of it. And that's where the interception happened, or that's where, that wide receiver wasn't where they should have been. So, we just don't know. And so it's not fair for us as fans, or even I would argue the media members, to place too much weight on all of the little minute details in camps and OTAs and all these sorts of things. What we need to focus on is more technique stuff and what we want to see people improve upon from where they were before to where they are now, because that is something that is playbook independent.
Right. And as Travis Tarbox here chimes in and he says, I believe that people need to relax with attacking Drew Lock. It's OTAs. I believe if he's going to make mistakes right now is the time to fix it. And Travis does have a good point here, Rich. And I'm going to actually reiterate something that I've said on this podcast maybe a while ago, but I'm pretty sure I've said it before. And that's that you kind of have to be careful how you take in these headlines that you see from these sports websites. And by that, I mean is, kind of take it with a grain of salt, because if you kind of get too invested in it, or if you believe too much in it, when the opposite of that happens, it's a big letdown, kind of like, for example, when Patrick Mahomes first came on to Kansas City before he took over the reins, he didn't understand a single play in Andy Reid's playbook. And I remember reading that article, and I was telling my best friend, I was like, look, dude, Patrick Mahomes is going to be a bust. He doesn't even know how to run the plays right. How are you going to be a quarterback in the league? And vice versa, when Case Keenum came to Denver, how different media outlets were, saying he's the gunslinger and, he's the next John Elway damn near, and, just hyping him up. And I got caught in that hype. I'm not going to lie. And when the total opposite happened, it was kind of like, that guy from the offseason and OTAs and minicamp and all that, that's the guy I was expecting to see in the field. And then the opposite happened when Mahomes took over for Alex Smith. So we as fans kind of have to, pump the brakes a little bit when you start seeing, Teddy Bridgewater, making these plays. Like, okay, he had an interception, but you have to realize that Bridgewater and Locke are two different quarterbacks. One is a veteran who's been around the league and he's been coached and played behind legendary quarterbacks like Drew Brees and had great offensive minds like Sean Payton and what have you. And Drew Lock has only had Pat Shurmur and Rich Scangarello. So two very different quarterbacks. And like I said before, Drew Lock has a bigger mountain to climb than Bridgewater.
Yeah, I mean, I'd also argue that Teddy came into the league slightly more polished than Drew as well. So in terms of their general starting off points coming into the NFL, Teddy was a little bit further ahead than Drew. I mean, most people, I think a lot of us forget this, is that Drew Lock came into the league, and one of the first major comments that was made by most people, including most draft analysts and all of Denver's media, who have seemed to have forgotten what they originally said, it seems, is Drew Lock had work to do. He was not a ready-made quarterback that was likely to be able to step in right away and look like a polished first-round pick, which is why he went in the second round. And he was going to need time to make those progressive steps. Now, that being said, I think it's also important to come with a bit of a fair and balanced critique on this as well, which is we saw Drew have a good majority of the season to see others play and then know that he was going to come in the following year, that being 2020, being the starting quarterback. And some of the things that were not playbook related, he did not seemingly, it looks like, at least to my eye, and I know that others agree with me on this as well, take the needed steps to correct some of those elements of his game. It does seem from his offseason comments this year, however, that he has attempted to make those conceded leaps and take that needed time to polish some of those elements of his game. Now it's just a matter, in my opinion, this is where I believe kind of Drew's at right now, is taking the practical that he's focused on in the offseason and working towards continuously putting it into practices and taking something from classroom and committing it to more default muscle memory in terms of what he does on the field. And if he can do that, and he can do that really well, I do think that Drew can really show us all what he's made of, and one of the reasons why he was drafted in the second round and not in, say, the later rounds, for example.
Yeah, very well said. And before we get to another question, we're just going to get to the boss's comment here. He says, obviously not everything hinges on OTAs and minicamp, but at the same time, Fangio already said that how the quarterbacks perform throughout the offseason will play into the final decision. And the boss is totally right on this here, Rich. And the interesting thing about this quarterback battle is it puts a lot of, for me anyway, it puts a lot of pressure on George Paton when it comes down to, I'm guessing, along with Vic Fangio in a combination, who they want to put as quarterback number one. Do they still believe in Drew Lock, John Elway's so-called choice, and, believe that maybe he still has a shot in him? Or do they go with George Paton's pick in terms of Teddy Bridgewater, who's, if you take what we've seen so far in OTAs, shown more promise in terms of ball control and, turnover ratio lower than Drew Lock. So with that being said, we're going to move to EJ's question, where he says, do you guys think Teddy can make Judy and Sutton 1,000-yard receivers this year? He had 2 last year with Carolina. I'll start off with you, Rich. Your thoughts.
So someone posted a comment or made a comment, and that it literally, they almost beat me to it, and I was kind of pissed because it's basically exactly what I was going to say. Sutton and Tim Patrick, to me, are very they're Drew Lock style receivers. Drew Lock having a specific style where he needs that zip code receiver, kind of like what Des Bryant was a little bit for Tony Romo when he was in Dallas, where you need that guy that can just kind of catch most things that are in your general radius. So that's what Sutton and Patrick are, at least for me. And so I actually think the receiver that will benefit the most, if Teddy does in fact beat out Drew in the quarterback competition, which has yet to be seen, and we need to see what happens. If I'm not going to lie, this preseason for me is probably going to be the most exciting one in a long time, because a lot hinges on 5, maybe even 6 positions on our roster on how people play. It's kind of the most potential we have for movement on our roster that I can remember, if just off the top of my head. And also the fact last season we didn't have preseason, so I kind of miss it. But
I did too.
Yeah, I know. You never thought I miss preseason. Yes, but it really is for the true fans and those fans that really just love the team. It's where you really get to see the depth on the roster play, and you often miss those guys because they often don't get on the field during the regular season, or there are special teams where you kind of miss what they can really do at their natural positions. But back to the question at hand, Judy, in my opinion, is the one receiver that will benefit the most if Teddy Bridgewater does in fact win that QB competition, because Judy lives in a timing row where it's, I'm going to do X, Y, and Z and get to this spot at this particular moment. Judy even made a few comments this offseason, and then I'll pass it off to you, is he made a few comments that he didn't really help Lock in certain circumstances last year because he wanted to get to his spot, but he took a couple too many moves to get to that spot. So he got to where he needed to be, but his timing was off as a result of him trying to do too much in order to get there. So it'll be very interesting to see with a veteran quarterback like Teddy Bridgewater working with more of a technician in regards to Jerry Jeudy. And I think you're going to see some really, really interesting things there, where I just think that Sutton, who's the other, receiver in that particular comment, I think he's kind of a little bit more geared. Don't get me wrong, he's still going to do well with Teddy, but I think he's geared a little bit more towards a guy like Drew Lock.
Yeah, that's actually very well said. My opinion, EJ, is that Teddy, because of his veteranship, has an advantage over Drew Lock. Drew Lock has to get over that hump that he's in. And if we go and look at this comment that the boss Mundungus made, he says, Mike Kliss came out with a story where he says it looks like Drew is playing to not lose the job. And that is what is playing into his poor performance so far. And that right there is very dangerous, because if Drew Lock is pushing himself more or farther, trying to prove himself, and it's not working, and it's actually making himself look even worse, then nobody benefits from that. Not Judy, not Sutton, nobody on the offense, especially Drew Lock, and that would be his job to lose. So with that being said, it all really depends on Drew Lock's turnaround. And I know I sound like a broken record every time I say it. If Drew Lock does not turn it around for the better, if he does not learn from his mistakes from last season, where, ball control and getting the ball out when it needs to be, and just finding his targets and keeping the turn down reception low, then I couldn't see him putting either one of those guys up over 1,000 yards a season, because then he would more than likely turn into a check down Charlie, just trying to get conversions instead of trying to get yards. But that plays into Teddy Bridgewater's hand in terms of, if he doesn't get the starting position and he plays back up to Drew Lock, where all Bridgewater would just have to do is wait for Drew Lock to have a really bad game, and then Vic Fangio would have no choice but to bench Lock and bring in Bridgewater. And if Bridgewater succeeds where Drew Lock failed, then that would make the decision going into the future of the season a whole lot easier for them to decide who the quarterback is going to be.
Right. So the big thing here, though, is what offensive style, like, is Shurmur going to revert back to his classics, or is Shurmur going to actually surprise the world and actually innovate? Because if he is going to actually attempt to innovate, then Teddy, while he may have a modest leg up, because Shurmur is going to be Shurmur anyways, just because he's stuck in the, somewhat in his ways anyway. So Teddy's going to have some of that familiarity with that as a general style. So I think some advantage does lean a little bit towards Teddy Bridgewater, just because veteran years in the league and Shurmur's style in general as an offensive style actually leans a little bit more towards Teddy Bridgewater. Mm-hmm. Kind of like how, in some of the previous pods, I was saying that Shurmur's style actually would likely have fit Joe Flacco better than Scangarello. And that's why I think we saw a lot when Flacco was benched for his injury, Drew Lock step in and all of a sudden play a little bit better, because I think that an offensive style that is more in the Shanahan, Scangarello general type of vein, I think suits Drew Lock a lot better than, as an example, a quarterback like Teddy Bridgewater or a quarterback like your Joe Flacco. So I don't know. To me, I think it all depends on offensive style. And so if Shurmur is looking to innovate, then I think Drew Lock actually has a better chance, because a playbook can be a little bit more open and a little bit more expansive, simply because Drew Lock does have more mobility than Teddy Bridgewater does. So he can actually expand certain plays just due to his underrated athleticism, because Drew Lock isn't necessarily touted as the athletic guy, but he is fairly athletic. I mean, he's not a Lamar Jackson by any stretch of the imagination, but he does have some mobility to him, certainly more than Teddy does. So it just depends on kind of what offensive styles we want that Shurmur is attempting to put on the field.
No, and I totally agree, and that's another advantage that plays towards Teddy Bridgewater's favor, where the offense is just because him and Pat Shurmur have a history together when they were both in Minnesota. So that's again, that's another rung for Drew Lock to try to walk over in terms of him trying to keep his number one starting spot. So EJ has another question here for us, Rich. He says, what are your thoughts on the Broncos being the 6th best receiving core this year, according to PFF? Now, I will tell you, I've heard a lot of things about PFF. Some people don't really agree with the statistics that they put out. They think that they're I don't want to say non-existent, but they don't mean anything or very well or what have you. But to me, I just think that that's something to be pretty happy about, especially since we don't have the best rated quarterback in terms of PFF. If I'm not mistaken, Drew Lock was rated literally the last rated quarterback out of every other quarterback in the league last season. So, being said the sixth best receiving core, that says something. Now, what Pat Shurmur and the offensive team can do about that is a totally different thing, and that's saying that we go through the first 8 weeks with everybody on the team, that because you never know, somebody could get traded from the offense, somebody could get hurt and replaced by somebody else during the regular season. I mean, a lot of things can happen, Rich, that can change the formula of how the offense is projected to play from week one. And that's just not for the Broncos. That's for every single team in the league. I mean, last year, who would have thought that we lose Christian McCaffrey in the football, and Saquon Barkley and some of the best players that you would imagine would never get hurt actually got hurt and had to sit out for the rest of the season.
Right. So here's the question I have for PFF, and this is kind of one of my gripes with some of their rankings is they present their rankings and they give the stats based on a specific category. But the one thing that is oft missing from those particular rankings is what criteria went into each of those individual stats, particularly the ones that are at the very least subjective. So, what determines catchability of a football from the quarterback? What determines route running? Which, I'm using generic, kind of open-ended, kind of interpretive questions and rankings and those types of things. Because as an example, I mean, here's a great example, right? Which is, that kicker has the best leg in the NFL. And then you find out he's the kicker for Denver, and 8 games a year he plays in thin air. So, and then you're starting to talk about his kicking distance as being a top of the line metric. Well, it's like, context kind of matters. The contextual backing of some the stuff that actually goes into those stats, it makes a huge difference. So when I look at stats like that, and I think this is why some people are actually pushing back a little bit more and more, I'm finding actually on some of the PFF statistics, is once you start going into less objective stats and more subjective stats, which PFF is attempting to kind of make some additional forays into, it really gets to be quite questionable unless they start presenting the evidence in terms of what makes up those subjective stats and what objective metrics and what their weightings were to get to that subjective stat in terms of who was who and what was what. So, I mean, could we have the sixth best? Maybe. Could we have worse than that? Maybe. I do think getting Courtland Sutton back is a huge windfall. He is certainly a top receiver in the NFL, regardless of the quarterback that is throwing him the football. But you are talking about a very dependent position group in wide receiver, and therefore quarterback play and the success of the wide receiver are often directly correlated, which is why you typically see top quarterbacks and whomever they're throwing the ball to tending to rank fairly highly in the NFL rankings year over year.
No, I totally agree with that statement there. And, being in the division that we're in is also not easy, Rich. I mean, you're dealing with, the former Super Bowl champion Kansas City Chiefs and, the power punch that is Kansas City and Patrick Mahomes. And then you're dealing with the pesky Raiders who always seem to start off strong and, end up crashing and burning towards the end of the season. And then you have the Chargers who, even after Phillip Rivers, we thought they were going to stay in the basement, and then they were able to land Justin Herbert, who's been a revelation for that team. And as much as I'd like to say, don't worry about the Chargers, we have to worry about the Chargers because they were the only team last season that we split a series with. We got swept by the Raiders and we got swept by the Chiefs. So going into this season, the offense needs to be better. They need to stop turning over the ball. They need to stop putting our defense in in awkward positions where they have to try to keep them to a field goal or force a turnover somehow. And more than anything, just stop gassing the defense out, because since 2015 and maybe even 2016, because the defense was still formidable in 2016, the defense has just been getting gassed because they've had to go out there and they've had to try to, limit the damage that the offense was just not able to either produce in most games, or it was just like, hey, we coughed up the ball in our red zone, and now please go out there and hold them to a field goal and keep them from scoring. So it's been those type of things, and then vice versa. There have been times where the defense, where a prime example was that Colts game 2 years ago, where Von Miller should have sacked Jacoby Brissett, I think it was, and he missed the sack, and Brissett was able to get the ball out to T.Y. Hilton, and the Colts were able to march up, and Vinatieri was able to kick the field goal for the win. So with that being said, Rich, let's switch gears over into the defensive side of the ball. You want to add something?
Sure. If I could, actually, this is perhaps even a better segue than that one. Back to EJ's comment on PFF. So this is actually a really interesting one, which directly segues into our defense. So as an example, PFF has a stat, or just the stats in general, had our defense last year ranking extremely high NFL-wise in terms of overall defensive ranking. And one of the reasons why we rank so highly on defense last year, don't get me wrong, we had a pretty good defense, and that was in large part because, in my opinion, I think we may actually have the best defensive coach in the league in Vic Fangio. So thank you for bringing him in, Denver Broncos. But the reason why we rank so high was because one of the primary objective statistical analysis to determine what a top ranking defense is the stat of total yardage. So what is the total yards against a defense? And that is one of the primary stats that goes into one of those objective rankings in terms of determining your defensive ranking status within the NFL. The problem with that is one of the reasons why we had such a low yards against on our defense was because our offense put our defense in such crappy positions that the offense of the other team had a very short way to go to get to the end zone. Mm-hmm. And one of the other things that was kind of undervalued when you look at the statistics and don't apply context to the statistics was the fact that our defense also gave up quite a number of points last year, despite the fact that we had very few yards against last year. So you can kind of see how some of those statistics, as it applies to our defense, which is what we're going into kind of directly head on next, you can see how those statistics, when context is not directly applied or looked at through the proper lens, you can look at stats and really it's quite misleading in terms of what's going on.
Mm-hmm. I totally agree with that statement there. So, but what I was going to also talk about, since we're on the defensive side of the ball, was, I don't know if you know, Rich, but the Broncos signed a new linebacker. I believe it was yesterday. Peter Kalambayi, former Houston Texan linebacker. So what that tells me, Rich, is that the Broncos little by little are building a depth chart. And while most of the guys you see on paper right now are probably not going to make the 53-man roster come at the end of preseason, it's still, it makes me happy to see that the Broncos learned what can happen when the injury bug is not just a bug, but not without current events in mind, that it's a virus where it doesn't just take one part of your team. It just goes and goes, and it just starts breaking you down little by little. And it put us in the situation where we were last year, where it was literally just scrambling to find players to either play quarterback or to play, on the defensive side of the ball.
Sorry, when you say quarterback or players to play quarterback, you mean wide receivers playing quarterback, right?
Yeah, wide receivers playing quarterback.
Yeah, okay. Sorry. I thought I'd quickly correct you there.
Yeah, thank you. And obviously, I'm talking about the New Orleans Saints game versus Denver, for those that weren't aware. So, with that being said, I don't know much about this young fella in Kalambayi. I haven't seen any tape on him when he was with Houston. But I kind of think that maybe it could be a nudge from Fangio on his current linebackers to say, hey, we're getting Justin Sternad back. Kalambayi could be playing for a spot on the roster. So watch out. Maybe not so much Alexander Johnson. We still have Brandon Browning, who's also supposed to be a pretty big good pick from this year's draft. But I'm just thinking, I'm just thinking that it's not looking all that great for Honey Bear, especially if one of these two guys goes out there and wows during the preseason, where it's like, okay, Josie Jewell, you're going to be the backup behind either Brandon Browning or Kalambai.
We did a linebacker episode
last week.
Last week, right?
Yeah.
I had such a busy week. Honestly, these whole days are just everything's a blur.
Yeah, they fly by.
Yeah. So time flies when you're having fun, right? So our last week's episode was on the linebackers, and one of the comments and things that I was kind of making, Boggins was with us, and he and I were kind of volleying a little bit back and forth in terms of, stylistic differences and where we believe they were going to go, where they are now, and that kind of stuff. And I still very much stand by my previous comments in last week's pod, which is I believe that the linebacker positions are going to be moving towards more of the Baron Brownings that are in the NFL, even if they require development, more so than the Josie Jewells of the NFL, simply just because the athleticism is required at this point in order to make up the sideline-to-sideline speed, particularly in a Fangio defense. So the gentleman that we brought up last week, and I say brought up as a very loose term, from the Chicago Bears in Roquan Smith.
Yes.
He was that kind of tweener style linebacker that came out through the draft that a lot of people were looking at him saying, is he a linebacker? Is he a safety? That kind of stuff. And he turns out he's quite a gifted linebacker, which is awesome for the Chicago Bears. But you see what that sideline to sideline speed can do for a team. You add that into a linebacking corps with a Danny Trevathan on the other side of him, who has that natural instinct of just knowing where the ball is going to go, just because he's a very smart guy. And you end up with a really good linebacking corps in the Chicago Bears. I think that what we're seeing from George Paton now bringing in some of these guys, like we're seeing here, is I think he's trying to backfill some of the depth on the roster with a little bit more speed at the linebacking position. And I suspect that has a lot to do with George Paton and Vic Fangio having some behind-the-scenes chats. After this year, I do not expect John Elway to be back, and I expect Paton to be running the show fully as the general manager. And Paton and Fangio, given the fact that the Fangio defense has been so prolific, I would argue, in the NFL because it's being copied so much, that is going to be extremely important for Paton to continue to build out that defensive style with the right players. And I actually think that the guy from Houston that they brought in, I'm glad you tried to pronounce that last name because I fumbled through it a couple times when I tried. I think the reason why they're bringing in guys like Baron Browning, guys like the gentleman that came in, Peter from the Texans, I think it's Peter K, right?
Peter Kalambai, I think.
Right, Peter K. Peter K. Yeah, I solve all name challenges and pronunciations by just cutting it short at the first letter of the last name. So Peter K from the Texans, I think that they're trying to fill out guys that fit a certain mold or a general mold, rely on our stellar coaching that we have, which I believe are particularly if I can kind of highlight our defensive coaching. I think we have Kolar in the defensive line, who is amongst the best. And I think that on the linebacking side and on the defensive back side, I think we have absolutely just incredible coaching at those particular three levels of our defense. And I think that we're starting to see our GM trying to leverage that by bringing in modestly developmental guys, learning under good coaches and behind good players, and to try and bolster our overall roster.
Yeah, you know what, Rich? I will say that I saw a picture today of because Kyle Fuller reported to OTAs today.
Yes.
And that pretty much, and I think that was Bryce Callahan that he was standing next to. I could be wrong.
Yeah.
But watching those two guys standing next to each other kind of reminded me of the 2018 season Vic Fangio had with the Bears, because I live in Chicago. So when the Bears were on that hot streak that season, I mean, here on TV and people just everywhere I went, that's all people were talking about, the possibility that even though Trubisky was struggling as a quarterback, that they just needed Trubisky to not throw a lot of interceptions and put the defense in awkward positions. And the defense yeah, exactly. And the defense could go out there and win. And so and made me kind of think about, well, this is Vic Fangio's third season with the Broncos defense, but even though he's coming in as a head coach, it's obviously a lot more different than when he went in with the Bears as their defensive coordinator that year. It's more responsibility, more hanging on his head. So, and the fact that we were able to land Patrick Surtain in the draft, and we have depth at cornerback with Michael Ojemudia and Callahan, as I mentioned, and we're getting some of our injured cornerbacks back. To me, that's a really good thing, because if our depth guys in terms of cornerback are not 100% by kickoff, these guys, knock on wood, would buy them time for them to be at 100%, where they wouldn't be in a position where, they get rushed out on the field just so they can, play. And we need that depth. And I believe that if the injury bug can stay away and just let Vic Fangio be Vic Fangio, that our defense can translate what looks really good on paper, go out on that field and just terrorize offensive teams and put the Broncos back on the playoff radar.
I agree. And interestingly enough, there's two position groups for me on the defensive side of the ball that we really need to see elevated play, or three, actually, if I'm going to be honest, we need to see elevated play from. One is on the interior of the defensive line. I think that's incredibly important that we get consistent pressure right up the middle of the field. People can argue with me all they want. I will stand by that statement all day long and every day. We saw what happened in the Super Bowl. We saw what our 2015 defense did when we had the interior pressure of Malik Jackson, aka the Batman, to Derek Wolfe, his Robin, on the defensive end side of the ball, and get that constant, steady pressure up the middle of the field. I mean, have you ever seen Tom Brady that uncomfortable in a football game? I know I haven't, and it was honestly a thing of beauty that I would love to watch repeatedly on repeat, because it was amazing. Yeah. And we need something like that again with the Denver Broncos in the interior of our defensive line. Moving down a level, we really do need better inside, particularly on the inside linebackers within those two. Alexander Johnson, in my opinion, is better suited for today's NFL than Josie Jewell. I really like Honey Bear. I think he's an awesome guy. He clearly knows his football, but it's kind of like one of those things where you had that really, really smart guy who knew a lot about sports in high school, but just was not athletic enough. We all knew that guy, and everyone knew who he was in high school. And I'm sure all of you are like, oh yeah, I know exactly who that was. Yeah. In my opinion, that's kind of like Josie Jewell for us. And I actually think someone like him could translate perhaps even eventually into a really good coach, because he knows all of the right things to do and the right ways to train, the right way to behave, the right way to act. Just, he doesn't personally have enough of the athleticism at the NFL level. In college, that's a completely different story. At the NFL level, to be that guy, whereas in my opinion, I think, probably in the near-ish future, we'll see Baron Browning maybe take over for Jewell. And then last and not least, the third level of our defense that I would like to see some elevated play from is the safety position. And I think part of that will be helped out with elevated play from the linebacker position, so that we no longer need to use our safeties as linebackers all the time to make up for the lack of athleticism at the linebacker spot.
Right. And I almost feel like this question, or not question, but comment, is more directed to what you just said, Rich, from the boss. He says, with the amount of cornerbacks and safeties that we have on the roster, do we really need anything more than a run stuffy inside linebacker? You know what, boss?
Yes.
I would say yeah. Because one of the things that really hurt us last season was not being able to stop the run. I mean, the Broncos did a really good job in limiting Derrick Henry to, I think it was just under 100 yards, if I'm not mistaken. And the time before they faced the Titans before then, they only limited him to like 50 yards. So thankfully, the Broncos have been the only team so far, knock on wood again, that King Henry has not been able to run buck wild on as of late. But, just because you're able to stop a guy like Derrick Henry doesn't mean that you'll be able to stop every single buddy, because there have been running backs over the past couple of years that, once they find a hole, if the linebacker's there, if he misses his shot, they're gone. And the best example I can think of, it wasn't even a running back. It was Sam Darnold. Who was it? Alexander Johnson missed the tackle on that blitz, and he was gone. And then Justin Simmons missed one. And then there was one where it can be argued, and I still argue with some people over this to this day, but Kareem Jackson, to me, I felt like he could have tried to make a play, even if he would have gotten Sam Darnold down at like the 2 or the 3, but I could have felt like he just let Sam Darnold run in. But either way, we do need that linebacker that if you see that that the opposing team is going to run the ball and the Broncos sniff it, that they're going to punish the running back for it.
If that play's correct, then that means you're saying that both safeties failed on that play. Justin Simmons was the first safety that whiffed on that tackle on Sam Darnold when he came in for that Sam Darnold run for the touchdown. And then you're saying the second safety should have made a better effort to the ball.
Alexander Johnson, I believe, was the first one. And he
missed, and then Justin Simmons missed that tackle too. And then Kareem Jackson. Again, that's kind of the whole point. Like, the entire point of safety is that they're meant to be a safety net to the defense. They're meant to be that kind of that last line of defense. And I agree that that's the whole point of that position. And we saw I go back to 2015 as a rough example. And I realize that Fangio and our 2015 defense, led by Wade Phillips as a defensive coordinator, is not going to be the exact same. I totally understand that. But when you have more versatile inside linebackers, particularly ones that have speed, that they can go horizontal, not just straight vertical in terms of run stuffing, as the comment there was, I believe it affords you much greater flexibility. So if you have sideline to sideline, as in horizontal speed within your linebackers, they can actually either stop or at the very least slow down and kind of prevent that big run break, which then allows a safety and a cornerback to come up and assist with the tackle and keep it to minimum yardage or minimal yardage. And what that then allows you to do is to stop doing what we had to do last year, which was, because our linebackers did not have that horizontal speed, particularly Josie Jewell. Again, like I said, I really like him, but it does not mean that physical gifts are there compared to other guys that are in the NFL. It then forced what you saw in our team, which was, depending on sides and depending on what kind of plays it was, you saw Justin Simmons having to come way up and kind of almost play in the box. And then you saw on the other side, or the other times, you also then saw Kareem Jackson come all the way up and play in the box. And they were almost acting as like a third linebacker, as opposed to being able to help out on the back end when it came to those potential throws. And that's where we actually saw some big kind of pass plays on us from time to time, where some of our safeties got beaten well over the top because they had to come forward to help with the run game to make up for the linebackers. They then got beat pretty badly over the top when it was like a play action pass where they had to kind of pick one almost, right? Mm-hmm. And that became a problem. And I think that having flexibility in the interior linebacker position, Baron Browning, perhaps the gentleman here from the Texans, we also have another guy, was it Montrez Nunez, I think, or I think is the other gentleman.
Montrez Nunez.
Guys like that, we need to see kind of where they play out in the preseason, what kind of athletic abilities they're able to show us on film and on tape, and when they're playing within the Fangio defense. And if they can kind of provide that flexibility and provide that speed sideline to sideline, plus the ability to tackle like a Danny Trevathan did for us, that really, really opens up Vic Fangio's ability on the defensive side of the ball.
Yeah, and you know what? One of the things that I think all Broncos fan wants to see is they want to see what we saw in this previous Super Bowl, where the linebacker was able to cover Travis Kelce. And everywhere Kelce went, there was a linebacker there with him, and the linebacker made sure that Kelce either didn't get, it was an incomplete pass, or if he caught the ball, that it wasn't for the completion. Because one thing that Travis Kelce has been killing the Broncos in is just finding ways to get open and not just catching a ball for a completion, but running for a lot of yards. And that's the tight end. Opposing tight ends have been the Broncos defense Achilles heel for the longest. So,
well, sorry, just to add on to that,
mm-hmm.
the other element that we need to remember and think about, I mean, Kelce still really did pretty well in that Super Bowl, if we're going to be perfectly honest. I think he had like 9 catches for like 133 yards.
Yeah.
So, I mean, don't get me wrong. If you're an elite tight end like Travis Kelce, you're going to do okay. However, what those linebackers did in the Super Bowl and what you really saw, like the big deal that happened there, and this kind of goes back up to, all you really need is that inside linebacker for run stuffing, is having a coverage linebacker, or at least a linebacker that can keep up with a slightly faster either tight end or slightly faster wide receiver or running back in the flat, for example, is you're helping to take away the initial first throw. So think about what you saw in the Super Bowl with Patrick Mahomes, right? How many times have you seen Patrick Mahomes have that annoyingly smirk grin on his face? Like, I just won, right? You just want to go out, and I'm a former rugby player. So guys like that, I just love to just clock with a solid hit up the gut. But anyways, I digress. What those linebackers did was they took away the first throw for Patrick Mahomes. Then he's like, oh my gosh, my elite skill position guy is covered when I wanted him to be X, Y, in position X, Y, or Z. And it forced him to move on to option 2, 3, or 4. And because he had to take himself off of option 1 or 2, it then basically slowed his reads down. Add on to that a competent pass rush and pressure up the middle, and you saw Patrick Mahomes, dare I say, look pedestrian and or at the very least beatable. And we need to be very mindful of that as the Denver Broncos, simply because we play him twice a year. So, right. I mean, if but nothing else, a linebacker like that, or like those guys, what we saw in Tampa Bay, they will give us a legitimate fighting chance.
Yes, and I totally agree with that. So, not to take anything away from the incoming class, Boss McCreasy, but we do hope that whatever these guys can bring to the table, that it's exactly what Denver is looking for. And although, like Rich said, it could be looking at Jewel across the room and say, hey, we appreciate what you've done with Denver the last couple of years, but we're going to need you to take a back seat. Type of deal. I'm not saying it is going to happen, boss. I'm saying it could happen. So, but we'll see what these guys can do in the. He says, "Leave my Honey Bear alone." We'll see what these guys can do.
Would he be opposed if Honey Bear became a player coach?
Maybe not right away, Rich.
No, like I mean, dead serious. Like he's clearly a skilled inside linebacker. Like I don't think anyone is arguing that, but. We almost saw that from some other players and some other teams where the guys that were really good at what they did, but just didn't quite have some of the requisite athleticism at their positions, kind of convert into like player coaches and kind of quasi kind of roles like that. So, I mean, I think that's a legitimate question. I mean, I would love to have a player coach like that, a guy that could jump in if they absolutely needed him, but clearly has the knowledge and the mental capacity to help pass on to guys that are perhaps more athletic than he is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think that would be a perfect way of retaining legitimate talent who, but just doesn't quite have the athleticism that we need.
Right. And you know what? I just my final point to that is probably just I don't envy Vic Fangio in that regard, because I believe he's going to have his hands full. Because the linebackers, to me, it's probably looking like the last piece of that puzzle where when you put it on paper for starting week 1, if he gets the right combination in, it's like, this defense is perfect, bring on the Giants type of thing. So Travis Tarbox has another question for us. He says, so are there any linebackers you guys are looking at for next year's draft? You know what, Travis? I'm just going to go out on a limb and say that if these linebackers we got so far with Brandon Browning and I forget
Barron.
the other Barron, sorry, thank
Barron
you.
Browning,
With Barron Browning and the other young man's name, who I forget, pan out, Columbai, who we just picked up. If those guys pan out, then
Justin
the Broncos,
Strnad and
Justin Strnad,
yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
If these guys pan out, which I mean, you know, fingers crossed they do, because that would be one less position that the Broncos have to look for in next year's draft, where they can address something that's they necessarily need, especially if we don't know where it is that they're going to land in that year's draft. So I haven't been really thinking about other linebackers. I believe the Broncos have other needs because there are a lot of contracts that are going to be up next season, Travis. Outside linebackers, if I'm not mistaken, some wide receivers. So it all depends on how George Payton is able to manage our money around and say, okay, we got money for you. We got money for you. Thank you. Have a nice day. If not, and vice versa and all that jazz.
That effectively sums up exactly where I'm at right now. I'm pivoted more towards our current roster at the moment. And as you're seeing, even with our team and our GM and you know, et cetera, we're seeing ebbs and flows, even at this stage of the game with George Payton, which I don't remember this much movement with Elway being the only, like, you know, the guy at that GM spot. I don't recall this much movement at all. As an example, we brought in Duffy from Kentucky. Which I honestly had an actual laugh out loud moment as soon as I saw that we actually signed Duffy from Kentucky. So I thought that was great. But we're bringing in legitimate competition at a lot of positions across the team. So I just think that we need to focus on who we have now. We need to look at who we're dealing with now. And then I think if you're going to give an honest and true evaluation of linebackers, particularly at the college level, we need to start seeing some of the guys that were sitting behind some of the starters step up and step in and give them a few games to see how they look on the field before we start, you know, giving, you know, tipping our hands because we just don't have all of the information yet, because there have been guys that would be backups that could very well surprise many of us in terms of showing out and saying, oh, wow, who's that?
Right. And, you know, before we close out today's show, Rich, I did want to talk about one more topic, and it's something that hasn't been talked about for a while. And it's kind of like breaking news, not so much for Denver anymore, but the fact that, you know, Jawan James, former offensive tackle, was signed by the Baltimore Ravens. And I believe the money he's getting from the Ravens is more towards his future to playing with them next season, because obviously there's no way he can play for the Ravens this season, even if the Ravens make the playoffs.
I have some information on that if you want. It's $500,000 guaranteed this year and $9 million next year.
Right. I do remember reading the numbers that the Ravens were paying him. So the Ravens are not paying as much as Denver did initially, but I guess the question now is that the Jawan James is still going after the Broncos because I believe he wants the Broncos to pay $15 million, which was a part of not his whole salary, obviously, but a part of it. And my only comment about that is, while I do feel bad for Jawan James getting injured, I don't wish injury on any player, whether they're current or former or not even Broncos at all. But at the same time, you know, Miami was pretty much the very first team that laughed at John Elway and the Broncos organization, and maybe even their fans, when the news broke out a couple of years ago when they signed Jawan James. So it was kind of like, you know, lesson learned. And I always, you know me, I always try to be optimistic and always look towards the better of things and say, hey, you know, maybe our Mike Munchak can take this guy and turn him around, make him a better guy. But unfortunately, he has not lived up to the hype, and it's another bust that goes in the another pick that goes in the bust category for, at the time, GM John Elway.
Yeah, I agree. I I've read this. I read it. I just kind of started laughing when I read it. So I did some digging into some of the stuff, and I actually think that was his only legal recourse. Mm-hmm. So the more I dug, the more I looked, the more I read, the more I kind of had a little chuckle, because he likely, and this is what made me laugh, is I believe he actually looked into every other legal avenue. And right. I actually think at the end of all of it, he realized that the only legal avenue he had to do anything like at all
right.
in the legal system was to basically come back and say, I believe you and the league colluded. Now, oddly enough, I actually think it's a pretty good rebuttal to what happened to him, because the league really put Denver in a really bad spot. And I'm very surprised the league did what they did. I thought they would have gone very generic, and I thought it would have gone very kind of like, glossed over. Mm-hmm. But the league themselves put out and called out Juwan James in their official press release.
Right.
And that may well actually be the main reason why he actually has a reasonable shot at winning this legal case, because the league put out the presser before the Denver Broncos put out any kind of official presser in terms of and made any official action. So the league basically put out that presser to the world, so media and everyone else, saying, use Juwan James as an example. He was practicing off-site. Like, they literally called him out in that press release, and then the Broncos then proceeded to do exactly what the NFL said to do in the press release.
Right.
So, as much as I hate to say it, I actually think Juwan James has a reasonable shot at the very least receiving a settlement. He may not receive the full $15 million, but I actually don't think he's necessarily looking for $15 million this year. I actually think he's just looking for something even, in the $9 million range, and say, I'll land on $9 million guaranteed from you this year, because $9 million is nothing to sneeze at.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, just ask our running back.
Yeah, exactly.
So, guys, unfortunately, that's going to do it for us today. We have run out of time. Rich and I would like to thank everybody that was able to join us today. The boss, McCreasy, of course, Travis Tarbox, Vic, Dave Glassman, EJ, thanks for asking all those great questions, my friend. Same thing with Travis. Mohammed Badri, thank you so much. Who else did I miss? Oh, KB was also here, who says, congrats to the Denver Nuggets. Joe Kitch on his MVP. And for those of you that might not know, that's NBA, because the Denver Nuggets are in the playoffs. But good luck to them. I wish my Chicago Bulls were in there. Also, Landon with the last minute see ya. So, guys, before I turn it over to Rich, let me just say, from myself personally, thank you guys so much. Also, one thing that we kind of did not get to talk about was the death of one of the, I'm trying to find his name. He was the former OC for the Broncos. And I can't find his name. Oh, Jim Fassel. Thank you. Who passed away today. So, rest in peace. Condolences to the Fassel family. And Jim will be sorely missed. So from everybody in Broncos country, Jim Fassel, thank you for your time. So, Rich, take it away.
I agree. We are on a quest for 1,000. Our goal, and we want it to be yours too, is to help us get to 1,000 subscribers here on YouTube. If you can please like, share, and reach out to any Broncos fans that you may know. We'd like them to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Make sure you click that little bell notification icon and like our videos. Another thing that greatly helps us grow and reach other like-minded Broncos fans just like you is commenting on our videos. If you have any questions, reach out, make those comments. And we can go from there and have an additional conversation even after we go off air. Help us in our quest for 1,000 here on YouTube with the Mile High Roundtable. For those of you who follow the Nothing Rhymes with Orange and Blue podcast, we want to make it our second mission. We want to hear over the PA at Empower Stadium at Mile High, the Mile High 5. Now, if we could have everyone at home That means you sitting in front of your computer screens and on your phones to join us in a mile high five. 1, 2, 3. Mile high five. Now, see, here's the thing. 6'10" and I are both pretty tall dudes. Combined height of a little over 13 feet. We have to be very careful about where we high five because it'll likely be completely off screen.
Very true.
It is. So, the other thing I want to just make sure we call everyone's attention to, and this can be part of your way of helping us reach that quest for 1,000, which is to go ahead and reach out to us and find us on Facebook, YouTube, Twitter, and Twitch. So on Twitch, Twitter, and Facebook, you can find us at MHRT Podcasts with an S. And on YouTube, you can find us at MHRT Podcast by doing a search or simply by typing it into the URL. We are also available wherever your favorite podcasts are available. So if you are a preferred audio listener or you like to listen via audio only to all of your podcasts, we welcome you to find us on anywhere you get your podcast from. And for those of us that do listen to it on podcasts, we typically, and we're trying to get better at it, make sure we call you out and reach out to you directly as well. We'd like to thank you very much for going ahead and listening to us on your favorite podcast medium. And if you have any questions for us whatsoever, please reach out to us on any social media platform. I am happy to reach out and respond to messages and direct tweets and all those types of things. And I know 6'10" would be as well. Next week, we will be back. And the current plan here on Broncos Talk is to have a continuation of our Ask a Fan segment. Next week, we plan on having a Jags fan join us to talk about all things Jaguars, Broncos, team building, how we both look and what we think we're going to look like when we face off against each other. I wanted to thank our Jags fan who's going to join us. We will be posting on Twitter the Jags fan's name, Twitter handle, amongst other things. So I please ask you that you follow us on Twitter, reach out to us on Facebook and everywhere where you will find information about our Jags fan. And yes, we will be talking about Tebow. And we have other podcasts on MHRT. Up next this week, we have our namesake podcast, Mile High Roundtable, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard, 6 p.m. Central, and 5 p.m. Mountain. On Sunday, we have Nothing Rhymes with Orange and Blue, 6 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Central, and 5 p.m. Mountain. I'm Richie Rich. On behalf of myself and a 6'10" Mexican, I'd like to thank you for joining us on Broncos Talk. Until next week, go Broncos.